Previously, we discussed the vlookup function. Vlookup is a lookup function, as its name suggests. With lookup formulas, we can search for data. For example, now we want to search for the sold items of the salespeople who are in column G. And of course, this is the table where we will search for the sold items of each salesperson here. You see that in column A we have the sold items, and in column B we have the names of the salespeople. In row 7 we have, for example, Olivia Anderson in column B and row 7, so in cell B7, and in cell A7 we have 1400, so these are the number of items that Olivia Anderson sold. This is what we will ultimately want to find. For this we will use a lookup formula that is more complicated and more advanced than vlookup. Don't get me wrong, vlookup is great, but it comes with the limitation that if we were to use vlookup, we would need to have column A come in after column B. With vlookup, we cannot do so-called left lookups. So when we search for a name with vlookup, then we have to make sure that the data that we want to be returned is to the right of the column where we have the names. Because vlookup always search in the leftmost column, so in the first column basically. But we will come up with a formula that is more complex than the vlookup function, but we will be able to do left lookups as well, so we will be able to return the values from the sold items column, even though they are to the left of the name column where we will search for the name of the salespeople. We will use a combination of the index and the match functions. Let's select cell H2 and let's go to insert function. So you see that the match function is the first for me in the select a function box, but if it's not there for you, then just search for the match function and double click on it. There is also an xmatch function which we could use as well, but this is only available in Excel 365 as far as I know. So let's stick with the simple match function, because probably a lot of people take this course who have an earlier version of Excel. The match function takes 3 arguments: the lookup value, the lookup array, and the match type. And the function itself returns the relative position of an item in an array that matches a specified value in a specified order. This might seem a bit complicated, but actually the match function is quite simple. It is important to notice that the match function returns a relative position. So basically what the match function does is, I will give the match function a range of cells from B1 to B17, and I will provide the name Olivia Anderson to the match function as well, and it will return the relative position of Olivia Anderson from cells B1 to B17 to me. Now our data starts in the first column, so the range is B1 to B17, and because Olivia Anderson is in the 7th row, then the number 7 will be returned to me. But match always returns a relative position, so if my table started on the 2nd row and finished on the 18th row, and I would give the match function the range B2 to B18, then Olivia Anderson would be in the 8th row, but the match function would still return 7, because the relative position is Olivia is 7 in this column. So she is in the 7th cell from the top. So be aware that this is not a row number that will be returned, but the relative position of an item in a range of cells. You can understand an array has a range of cells. An array is a collection of values, but in reality you can think about a range of cells as an array, so as a collection of values. Okay, let's provide the lookup value for the match function. So the lookup value is the value you use to find the value you want in the array or a range of cells, a number, text, logical value, or reference to one of these. Now we will provide text, so Olivia Anderson. So actually cell G2. We are providing a reference to a cell, and Excel processes it as text, so as the text Olivia Anderson. The lookup array will be cells B1 to B17, but we have to make the references absolute, so you can just press F4. While you're still in the lookup array field, and then Excel will make this lookup array reference absolute. And of course the reason for that is we will copy this formula down, and we don't want the lookup array reference to be adjusted. And of course here is the description of the lookup array. It is a contiguous range of cells containing possible lookup values, an array of values, or a reference to an array. In other words, this is the range of cells where we expect to find Olivia Anderson. There is also a match type argument, which is a number 1, 0, or -1. And let's use the number 0. The number 0 will return an exact match only. 1 and -1 are different types of non-exact matches. But while we were discussing the vlookup function, we discussed that if we want to find a person, then we should always use an exact match. We already see that the result of this functional formula will be 7, but let's click on OK to confirm that. And indeed, so the relative position of Olivia Anderson in this column, or this range of B1 to B17, is 7. Let's copy the formula down. So everything looks good. You see that the absolute reference did not change, but of course cell G2 changed to cell G3 when searching for Jessica Stone, and her relative position is 8 in this range, and it is true because she is just below Olivia Anderson. Sarah Parker is just below Jessica Stone, so she is 9, so her relative position is 9 in this range. There is no Peter Jackson in this range, so we received an NA error. It is also good. But there is a Jane Jackson who is in the relative position of 17, so the match function works properly. The match function is only half of what we need for our advanced lookup formula. But it is important that you understand what it does before we start using this advanced lookup formula. We've discussed the match function previously. Let's recap the index function now, and then we can move forward, and then we can finally put our advanced lookup formula together. We can provide a range to the index function, so we can provide this whole table to the index function. And the index function returns a value to us based on its relative position, so the relative row number and the relative column index or number. If we want to return 1400, so the sold items of Olivia Anderson, then the relative row number will be 7, because she is in the 7th row and the range starts from row 1. And the relative column number will be 1, because this is the first column of the range. Let's select cell H2. Let's use the insert function command, and let's search for the index function. It's on the top for me, but still, if it's not here for you in the select a function box, then just search for it, and then we can double click. For our purposes, it doesn't matter which implementation we choose, so we can go with the first option in the select arguments box. So the index function returns a value or reference of the cell at the intersection of a particular row and column in a given range. We've actually already discussed this, so we provide a range from cell A1 to cell E17, and based on the relative row number and the relative column number, then the index function will return a value to us. The array argument is the range of cells, or an array constant, so it's the range of cells from which we will return our value, so A1 to E17, but let's make this an absolute reference. So let's press F4. Let the row number be 7. So the row number selects the row in the array or reference from which to return a value. So for sure we are returning something from row 7. But keep in mind that this is a relative row number. So if our range started from A2 to E17, then this row number would be 6, because then A2 would be basically at relative position 1. But our range starts from A1, so from the first row, so the relative row number is 7. And the column number is 1, because we want to return a value from the first column, so from column A. Of course, this is also a relative position, or a relative column number. If our range started from cell B1, then the column B would be the column number 1. But you see that 1400 has already been returned, so the sold items of Olivia Anderson. Let's click on OK. So this is actually the prototype of our advanced lookup formula. We return the value that is to the left of column B, and this is the column where we are going to search for Olivia Anderson. So this is something that vlookup would not be able to do for us. vlookup would only work if the name column came earlier than the sold items column. So if we changed these two columns, then vlookup could work. But we don't have to change anything, and the index function returns the correct value to us. Of course, what we have to figure out is how to get the relative row number and how to get the relative column number. Because now I hard-coded it, but of course we need a dynamic function that returns these relative positions to us. And I think that you already know that we will use the match function to return these values dynamically to us. I've talked about the importance of a relative position or a relative row number or a relative column number. Let me change our range from A1 to E17 to A2 to E17, and I will not change the relative row number and the relative column number. Let me press enter, and now you see that 1800 has been returned. So now we are taking this range, so from row 2 to 17, and we are taking the first column, so the relative first column, and of course it's column A now, and we are taking the 7th relative row. And because our range starts from row 2, the 7th row will be row 8. So the number of sold items by Jessica Stone is returned to us. So now you've seen how the index function works and how the match function works. So it's time to put these two together, to combine them and arrive at our advanced lookup formula. Right now, in cell H2, we use the index function to return the sold items of Olivia Anderson. We provided the range of A1 to E17 to the index function, and we are taking the value from the 7th relative row and from the first relative column, so from cell A7 in this case. Now, of course, our task is to make the 7 and the 1 here, so the relative row number and the relative column number, dynamic, so that based on the name of the salesperson, we will always get the correct result back. This formula, of course, can only work for Olivia Anderson now. What we will do is to use the match function instead of providing a hard-coded relative row number. So the correct value will be returned to us dynamically. Let's start typing them, so let's delete the 7 and let's type match. Let's press tab, so we will have our opening parentheses. The lookup value, so the value that we are searching for, is in cell G2, of course, Olivia Anderson. Let's put a comma here. Now the lookup array is cells B1 to B17, and let's make this an absolute reference. After the comma, let's change this 1 to 0, so we want an exact match. Now the number 1 that was here previously was from our index function, so it was the column number. So let's add it back because we need it, but we have to add it back after the closing parenthesis of the match function. So let's put a comma here, and let's provide a 1, because of course we will need to get the 7th value from the sold items range or column. Let's close the parentheses and let's press enter. And the correct value has been returned to us, so let's copy this formula down. And we see that our index match formula works perfectly, so the correct results have been returned back for Peter Jackson as well, because there is no Peter Jackson in our table. So of course an NA error has been returned, meaning that there has been no match or nothing was found for Peter Jackson. Of course now the column number, so the relative column number, is hard-coded, so we are still not finished. But before making the column number dynamic as well, let me walk you through this index match formula. We provided the range of A1 to E17 as the first argument to the index function. And we also provided the column number 1, so the index function will for sure return a value from the first column, so from column A. Don't forget that this is a relative column number, but because our range starts in column A is the column number 1, or the relative column number 1. But for the row number, we used the match function, so we did not hard-code a value for the row number, or the relative row number more specifically. The first argument of the match function is G2, so a reference to cell G2, so the text Olivia Anderson. We're searching for her in the range of B1 to B17, and the 0 means that we want an exact match. The match function will return 7 to us because Olivia Anderson is in the 7th relative row. In this range of B1 to B17, name is in the first relative row, Peter Floyd is in the second relative row, Peter Smith is in the third relative row, and so on and so on. So the match function returns 7 to us. So now the index function knows that it has to take the value from the 7th relative row from the first relative column. So we arrive at the correct result of 1400. Before we move on, so that we will not have to hard code the column number, but it will be returned to us dynamically, let's evaluate our formula. So if you're not on the Formulas tab of the ribbon, then click on the Formulas tab, and then let's go to the Evaluate Formula option. And we see how Excel evaluates our formula. So the first thing Excel evaluates is a reference to cell G2. Let's click on Evaluate, and you see that Excel evaluated this as Olivia Anderson. Now the next step is that Excel is going to evaluate this whole match function. Now Excel has all the information, so Excel knows that it has to find Olivia Anderson. It has to be an exact match, this is why the 0 is here, and Excel knows that it has to find the relative row position of Olivia Anderson in this range, so from B1 to B17. Let's click on Evaluate again, and you see that 7 has been returned, so Olivia Anderson's relative row position is 7, because Excel knows everything to evaluate the index function, so it knows the range A1 to E17. Excel will now evaluate the index function because Excel has all the information to do that. So now Excel knows that it has to work with the range of A1 to E17, and it has to return the value from it that is in the 7th relative row and in the first relative column. So let's click on Evaluate, and of course we get back 1400, so the sold items of Olivia Jones. Let's click on Restart actually. Next to Evaluate we have an option Step In. This option is not always available, but basically if we use Step In as well, then we can break the formula down even more. So you see that Excel first wants to evaluate the value behind the reference to cell G2. If instead of Evaluate we click on Step In, then Excel will give us back the value Olivia Anderson, color the reference with a purplish bluish color, and in the same purplish bluish color it will actually spell out the exact reference to this cell. So we are referring to cell G2 on sheet 1. Now the options of evaluating and stepping in are grayed out, but we can step out and we could continue evaluate the formula, but we have already done this, so let's move on. And let's change our formula so that the column number will be returned dynamically to us. Let's select cell H2. So now we are using the combination of index and match to look up the sold items of Olivia Anderson or the other salespeople as well. So the match function, as the second argument of the index function, returns the relative row position of Olivia Anderson. But the relative column position is hard-coded. Now we see that we need the sold items, so we know that it is the first relative column of the range from A1 to E17. But this is of course not always the case. So what we have to do is to use the match function once again, so that the relative column number will be returned to us dynamically. Of course, when we are looking for a column, we need to identify that column somehow. And of course, we have to know the column header of the column whose relative position we want to return from this range. So we need the sold items column. Let's delete this one and then let's type our match function. Okay, once Excel finds this, we can press Tab. And so in this case, the lookup value will be the column header, which will be sold items. If you notice, then the sold items text is present in cell H1. So now we can refer to cell H1, but let's make this reference absolute. So press F4, because of course when we copy down the formula, we don't want this reference to be adjusted. So we want to look up the sold items text now. And our lookup array has to be the header. So from range A1 to E1, and we have to make this reference absolute as well, so press F4, because we don't want this reference to be adjusted when we copy the formula down. So now we have the range of our column headers, and the sold items column is in the relative position of 1. This will be returned to us by match, but we have to put a comma and a 0, because of course we want to find an exact match, so the header that exactly says sold items. We still have to add one more parenthesis, because this red parenthesis closes our match function, so the second match function, but the index function has not been closed, so let's just click after the closing parenthesis, and let's add another closing parenthesis. Let's press enter, and now our advanced lookup formula, our index match formula, is fully dynamic. Let's copy it down quickly. And the results are still good, still the same as before. Peter Jackson is still not found, of course, but the other results are the correct ones. Let's say that instead of the sold items, I actually want the profit to be returned that was made by each salesperson. The only thing I have to do now is to change the value of cell H1 from sold items to profit. And now, instead of the sold items, the profit values are returned. So 600 for Olivia Anderson, 1000 for Jessica Stone, 1000 for Sarah Parker, and 500 for Jane Jackson. This is also a reason why the index match formula is so powerful. Just changing one value in one cell, we get back totally different but valid results. Of course, it's very important that in both match functions, the range is correct. In the first index function, the range has to be in the column B because we are looking for a name and names are in column B. And in the second index function, we have to provide the range of the header of the column headers because we are looking for a column header here. But if you pay attention to this and you really understand how the index match function works, then it shouldn't be a problem for you anymore to look up any value in any table.